Blizzard dropped some huge changes this week, and a new melee spec might be about to take over. Meanwhile, enhancement shamans and BM hunters were given some steroids, and you know what that means.
Down goes Ben Rookie!
Anyway, today we will be covering all of the biggest changes from this week's tuning and predict the new solo shuffle meta for Season 1. One thing that was missing from the patch notes was the massive buffs that just happened to the skill-capped add-on. We've partnered with the world's best players to ensure that skill-capped UI is ready for every class in the War Within, and to bring you exclusive guides that unlock the full potential of your class. From maximizing damage to perfecting crowd control and outsmarting opponents with the latest tech, we've got you covered. While everyone else is confused, you can instantly get ahead of the curve with our guides, designed to fast-track your progress and put you miles ahead of the competition. We're even so confident in our service that we guarantee you'll gain at least 400 rating or you'll get your money back. So why wait? Click the link in the description below and join SkillCap today. Let's kick things off with the biggest changes happening on the melee side. Unholy DKs saw two nerfs this week. The first to Frost Fever damage, and the second to that neat little hero talent that allows a horse to proc an AMS for some reason. Unholy was already one of the best melee, and there is still lots of bandwidth for even more nerfs, and even if that happens, they'd still be a high-tier threat, especially considering how oppressive they are in caster lobbies. We should also mention that Fury Warrior was nerfed even harder, which helps Unholy's standings quite a bit. Anyway, despite the tiers from DK mains, we still think Unholy is still at least A+ tier. Moving on, Demon Hunter has been underperforming so far this expansion, especially considering that at one point during Dragonflight, they seemed like an absolute plague. Blizzard has responded twofold, with a buff to the hunt and some potential bug fixes. For now though, we still expect DH to simply feel like a weaker version of Windwalker Monk, and it would need to see more sustained damage buffs in order to get back to the high tiers. Feral Druid, on the other hand, was already performing fairly well and got some shiny damage buffs, probably because of PvE or something. This might seem like a hot take, but we're not actually going to move Feral at all. They were already on the A tier, and we still don't think they're as competitive as some of the heaviest hitters in the bracket. Sure, Feral damage is really good, but S tier good? Probably not. The spec can still suffer some survivability issues and can just feel a bit awkward in lobbies, while also getting passively countered by one of the best healers. Feral also continues to have a much steeper learning curve than virtually every other spec in the game, so even though it might be S tier for experienced players, it's not nearly as strong for beginners. Windwalker Monk has definitely been a solid performer in the early season and was hit by a combo of nerfs and buffs, and based on what we've heard, these changes are relatively neutral. Strike of the Windlord was buffed, which is definitely good, but damage alone isn't really what makes Monk so strong. Windwalker is more or less a micro CC machine now, with knocks and clashes ready to torment any poor player who thinks it's a good idea to try and cast a spell in the year 2024. As you know by now, damage plus micro CC is what generally wins in solo shuffle, and given that both Fury and Unholy were nerfed, we think Windwalker Monk is passively better and good enough to go up half a tier. Ret Paladin, on the other hand, was not so lucky, after seeing a minor damage nerf while also being one of the worst melee in the bracket. Right now, the spec seems to be lacking the finish power that historically has made Ret so great. If you like getting bullied, then this spec might be for you, since it gets absolutely hammered by any of the meta specs. The only reason we're not ready to pull the trigger and move the spec down to C tier is because it is a Paladin after all, which means having a lot of defensive carry potential. Speaking of defensive, Outlaw, which is arguably the most defensive rogue spec, saw a mix of flat damage nerfs with a few buffs to their tier set sprinkled in. This is likely due to their performance in PvE, where Outlaw is one of the highest ranking DPS. While these nerfs might seem bad for Outlaw rogue enthusiasts, we doubt that it will affect their relative ranking whatsoever. It is definitely the worst rogue spec, but still a rogue. On the flip side, Enhancement Shaman was also doing pretty well in PvE, so much so that Blizzard did aim some key nerfs at the spec, especially the one to Wolf CDR. But not to worry, since Enhance saw what might be the most dramatic damage buffs, and the key ones here are Lava Lash and Frost Shock of all things. Before you get too excited, we only think this will be enough to move the spec up only one tier. At the end of the day, Enhance suffers some more fundamental problems than just damage alone. As one of the few remaining melee without a Mortal Strike, and as a spec that has fallen behind in the melee mobility race, don't expect it to pull ahead anytime soon. Fury Warrior, on the other hand, was looking like a clear winner in the early season, and was hit by some fairly decent nerfs to Bladestorm and Odin's Fury, which helps close its gap above other high-tier melee. So much so that we're actually going to move Fury down to the A+ tier to join the recently nerfed Unholy DK and the 2 untouched rogue specs. We should note that Arms Warrior got an identical nerf to Bladestorm, but its rank remains unchanged. For the record, we really don't think Arms Warrior is that bad, it's just that Fury is so good that Arms seems much weaker by comparison. If you've been playing WoW for a while, you already know that most warriors simply ping-pong between whatever spec is best. It's business as usual. So it's possible that with even more nerfs to Fury, we could see Arms regain its lead, assuming it also gets a few buffs, of course. That brings us to our updated tier list for Season 3, and you might notice a spec missing. While it didn't get any direct changes, Assassination Rogue might actually be sleeper OP. With nerfs to some of the strongest and bulkiest melee combined with several buffs to some of the caster DPS we will cover later on, the meta might be ripe for assassination. Right now it seems like the best rogue spec in every bracket and is arguably the easiest to play, making it quite strong at every rating. So as much as we would like to put Asa in the S tier, we're going to be conservative and keep it on the A+ tier for now. With our melee tier list out of the way, let's take a look at what's happening in the ranged meta. Balanced Druid has had a pretty slow start to the season, both in PvP and especially in PvE, which is why Blizzard slapped on some pretty big damage buffs, especially to Star Surge. Boomy main should definitely be excited about this change, as it means much stronger finishing power, but we don't expect the relative strength of Boomkin to change by much. Almost every meta healer right now has a way to get out of or completely avoid Root Beam, which definitely hurts the win condition of the spec, making the buff to Star Surge a necessity more than anything else. So while Boomkin is definitely going to be better, we don't think it's at the level of some of the other bangers in the bracket. One of those bangers is Devastation Evoker, who saw a mix of buffs and nerfs, giving them less overall DPS with Disintegrate, but potentially even better finishing power thanks to a buff to Eternity Surge. We're still confident in our previous rankings where Devastation was on the A+ tier, and although the spec is seeing nerfs, it might feel better to play thanks to Eternity Surge hitting slightly harder, which can help close out games. Now, if there's one spec that you should definitely monitor this week, it's BM Hunter, which we previously had as a wild card, but will now be moving all the way up to the A tier. BM Hunter is getting some pretty significant damage buffs, which we think are enough to make it a high tier threat. During our last tier list, we mentioned that one potential weakness of BM is the fact that it is now essentially a dot class that is forced into attacking one target all game. This weak point might actually be offset if the damage is high enough to be unhealable and dampening, and with BM Hunter being one of the easiest specs in the game to play, we might see them slowly creep up to Marks in popularity. Speaking of which, we're also going to make a small correction to our previous tier list and move Marks Hunter up half a tier. At this point, we have enough data to back up the fact that Marks is easily one of the most dominant solo shuffle specs, and with the exception of triple melee lobbies, it really doesn't have many bad matchups. Moving on to the 2 worst mage specs, Arcane was hit with some hero talent nerfs, once again due to their performance in PvE. But we don't expect this to affect their ranking at all in solo shuffle, and they will continue to be a mid-tier caster limited by their outdated design. Fire Mage, on the other hand, is a spec that should be good on paper, but is severely limited by damage output. While the spec is seeing some overall damage buffs, we still think it's doomed for the C tier. As a quick math lesson, buffing 0 by 6% is still 0. Shadow Priest was yet another spec to see flat damage buffs, but as a higher tier spec. For now, we will be keeping SP on the A tier, but we could see it move up half a tier to A+. The nerfs to Fury Warrior and Unholy DK is a passive buff to Shadow, but we don't expect all their problems to instantly go away. The spec has enormous damage potential, but is still very prone to getting completely shut down. Affliction Warlock is in a similar boat, and is seeing a mix of buffs and nerfs. Corruption, Wither, and Shadow Bolt were all nerfed, with UA and its backlash effect actually getting damage increases. For now, we think Affliction is obviously a little bit worse, but not enough to bump it down a tier. Demo Warlock is potentially the biggest question mark this week. The spec is getting some pretty significant damage buffs, especially to Felguard, which should include all of its abilities too. While Demo Warlock is one of those specs that is burdened by hard casting and lacks the ability to truly control tempo, we do think this is at least enough to bump it to the B tier for now. Destruction Warlock will also be a difficult spec to predict, as it received both a mix of buffs and nerfs, both in PvP and PvE, with a crucial 30% damage nerf to Wither. This is the keystone ability of the Hellcaller hero tree, which gives Destruction Warlock an instant immolate, and is a huge source of their overall damage. Fundamentally, Destruction Warlock is always very solid in solo shuffle, and with Infernals now being a 2-minute CD, we think that the spec will have enough finishing power to move up half a tier. Overall, the ranged meta is looking even stronger and more competitive. We're still standing by our decision to have Frost Mage on the A+ tier instead of S. While they were definitely broken on the beta, the recent nerfs to Ice Lance were enough to tone them down. We're also continuing to be optimistic for Ellie Shaman, which got a recent bug fix, which should help some damage problems related to pets. And with every DPS out of the way, let's wrap things up with healers. First up is Resto Druid, who got some damage buffs of all things, which once again are probably related to PvE. Ironically, Resto Druid damage was already pretty good, but unlike Disc and Preservation, who can deal damage more passively, Resto Druids are way more global starved in solo shuffle, which will make it hard to truly benefit from these buffs. For now, we're still confident that Druid is still an A-tier healer. While we had Preservation Evoker on the top of our healer tier list last time, it will be moving down half a tier to join Disc Priest. Even though Preservation only got a single healing nerf with class tuning, it's actually a pretty major one. Both their Keystone and Endcap hero talents will be nerfed too, since they directly interact with Living Flame, which is actually one of their best heals thanks to Afterimage. The advantage Preservation had in the early season was that a lot of cleavy damage specs were doing very well, which allowed the spec's incredible AoE healing to truly carry. But now with specs like Balanced Druid, BM Hunter, and Destro Warlock becoming more competitive, Preservation might be passively weaker. But speaking of weak, Mistweaver Monk was randomly hit by a nerf to Peace Weaver, likely due to its continued strength in BG Blitz. But hey, look, a 3% healing buff. Jokes aside, Mistweaver is still the worst healer and will be staying on the C tier. It simply has too many fundamental problems and needs some serious buffs in order to be highly competitive. Moving on, we have Holy Paladin, who was another healer to see some damage increases, with some defensive buffs also sprinkled in. Overall, though, we don't think these are enough to change its rankings. Last time we had Holy Paladin on the B tier, and we continue to stand by that decision. The biggest problem Holy Paladins face is not really their damage or their survivability, it's simply just output, which seems to be lacking for the time being. The final remaining healer to see buffs was Resto Shaman, who also got some damage buffs. Cool? I guess? Thank you, PvE. Anyway, last time we had Resto Shaman on the A tier, and it's probably staying there for now. Along with Resto Druid, Shamans are simply overshadowed by our Preservation and Disc Priest overlords. Anyway, that brings us to our updated healer tier list. We definitely underranked Disc Priest in our previous tier list, and now with the nerf to Evoker, we definitely think it will be the #1 healer. We also made the decision to move Holy Priest down to the C tier. Right now, it's just super struggling to heal in Deep Dampening, and with games lasting longer on average, this is a huge problem. Anyway, that's our updated healer meta for Season 1. And remember, Skill Capped is the only service that guarantees you'll climb at least 400 rating. We make this promise because our service really does work, and if it doesn't work for you, you should not pay. Think of it like a gym membership that guarantees you'll get ripped. Crazy, right? So get started today by clicking on the link in the description. For now, we want to thank you all for watching. See you soon.